It's also possible for these dictators to simply be good actors and moan and groan about, oh, it's so bad that I have all this power, and pretend that it's, very, very painful to be thrown into this briar patch. It might not be real. All right, hello everybody. Today we are starting part 18, second to last, or possibly third to last, depending on whether I do a wrap-up. But we are finishing up Rousseau's Social Contract in the next couple of weeks. This is going to be part 18. We're doing book 4, chapters 5 through 7. Next one will be chapters 8 and 9, which will technically finish the book, and then I'll decide whether I want to kind of put in an additional episode for kind of a wrap-up summary or not. So let's get started. Starting with Book 4, Chapter 5, The Tribunate. Now, Rousseau starts this chapter with a quote that I'm going to read, an extended quote because it's kind of important. Quote, "When an exact proportion cannot be established between the constituent parts of the state, or when causes that cannot be removed continually alter the relation of one part to another, recourse is had to the institution of a particular magistracy that enters into no corporate unity with the rest." End quote. He continues to say that the tribunate is a way to bring relations between prince and people, or prince and sovereign, or both, into correctness. Now, of course, this has been one of my complaints throughout this whole book, but this exact proportion that Rousseau is talking about is really an illusion. There's no real numbers there to actually look at and compare. It's always going to be a big fudge factor of like, oh, well, it depends on this for the people or something. And this is similar to Rousseau's concept of the sovereign and the general will themselves. Therefore, the more likely use of a tribunate is not to actually do good things, but more likely it will be used for some group to wrest power from some other group, and there's not going to be any objective understanding as to which group is in the right. Generally, this will result in an increase of the power of government over time, just as the history of the American Supreme Court has been, kind of a slouch toward totalitarianism, one bad precedent at a time. Rousseau says, to summarize, that the tribunate is, quote, "the preserver of laws and of the legislative power," end quote. And the obvious caveat here is that, yeah, it might be if you're extremely lucky and maybe for a little while, but how are we to distinguish a good tribunate from a bad one in such a way that isn't simply an expression of personal preference, right? We need some kind of objective standard, but Rousseau doesn't provide one for us. Doesn't even provide a hint as to how we might derive one, so it's kind of useless. Rousseau then refers to the Council of Ten at Venice, or the Ephors at Sparta, Ephors. And, again, I generally speaking, historical research is outside of the scope of this critique, but I did actually stop to take a quick glance at the Wikipedia article on the Council of Ten. Well, what they were a body that they would get elected for 1 month at a time or something like that, and they would all go into a fortress and sit there, and they couldn't leave, and they would basically decide on punishments for nobles. And they were highly secretive. They and then over time, they kind of had mission creep, as government projects usually do, and they effectively ruled Venice after they had been around for a bit. Rousseau is literally looking at a shadow cabal as an example of good government, and I feel like it's one of those things where, yeah, it might be useful sometimes, but how do you ensure that it doesn't overstep its boundaries? Well, maybe Rousseau will have some more guidance for us in the rest of the chapter. Narrator, there was not any more guidance. So Rousseau says that the tribunate has no legislative or executive power, but, quote, "can prevent anything from being done," end quote. But this isn't really a solution. One of the problems with states and with bodies of law as they grow in size or power or complexity is that various lines become very blurry, right? An obvious one is the line between taxation and robbery, right? The government wants you to believe that there's a very sharp delineated line between taxation and robbery. But if you actually think about it logically, the only line that's actually there is kind of this magic fairy dust that's sprinkled on IRS agents, to my understanding. But another one of these possible lines is between the government doing something and the government not doing something, right? The abolition of some particular welfare payment, is that doing something or is that refusing to do something? Well, it turns out, of course, that lawyers, if given the opportunity, will make the argument either way depending on who's paying them, and they will have similar efficacy in both directions. And so it ends up being kind of a toss-up, and due to the innate bias of government stuff, usually the toss-up will go toward the group that wants more government power. This is a problem that Rousseau completely ignores, and of course he does, because he doesn't actually seem to care about any details. He's just kind of blabbing at us. Quote, "The Tribunate, wisely tempered, is the strongest support a good constitution can have, but if its strength is ever so little excessive, it upsets the whole state," end quote. So basically, it's a great tool unless it gets just a little bit too much power, and then it's horrible. It sounds like a really excellent institution, doesn't it? Something that you really want, something where you're basically, Rousseau is constantly relying on these special institutions with these hopes that they ought to do good. But why he does so is beyond my understanding. You're basically putting the government on the edge of a knife and saying, well, the Tribunate's good unless it gets just a little too much power, and then you fall into tyranny. Well, why would we even institute such a thing to begin with? It doesn't make any real sense. Rousseau details a couple of ways that the Tribunate can become tyrannical. He says that it can become tyrannical by taking over executive function, that is to say, doing things, which we've already explained is hard to distinguish between not doing things when you have this complex system of laws. And then he says it should focus on restraining executive power. It also can be tyrannical if it tries to, quote, dispense with the laws which it should confine itself to protecting. The problem, of course, being that maybe there are bad laws, or maybe there are laws that need to be changed, right? And then there's this should, but there's nothing really in the framework or incentive structure that's been built here to enforce that, or even to promote it. The more Rousseau I read, the more I kind of stand in awe of the American founders and their attempts, though somewhat failed, to create a system that actually kind of pulls against itself in order to avoid growing out of control. It did a fairly good job for a decent amount of time. But none of that wisdom of like, oh, well, we'll build this system, and then we'll build this system, and we'll set them up so that they're pulling against each other rather than against the people. That's something that you might set up in a framework to kind of set up incentives in such a way that, the bad incentives are minimized. But none of that wisdom or even hard work is present here. Rousseau is just kind of throwing out random ideas with these horrible incentive structures, and then he oh, you should do this, and it should be good, and then he moves on to the next thing without really so much as a justification or even a little bit of analysis. Rousseau says that the ephors of Sparta were, quote, harmless as long as Sparta preserved its morality, end quote, but their power, quote, hastened corruption when once it had begun, end quote. In Rome, he says, excessive tribune power protected bad emperors. But the problem here, of course, is that he's kind of baked in this idea of the Sparta preserving its morality, right? A good people, Rousseau has already admitted, doesn't need government. So by the point that the ephors actually meant something, they were already hastening corruption because the people were already immoral. Rousseau is not making a strong argument here by my evaluation. He's basically saying that, as I mentioned before, things kind of sit on the edge of a knife, and then Rousseau acts surprised when after some period of time they fall off. Well, obviously they're going to fall off. The incentives are in favor of them falling off. Rousseau continues, quote, the Tribunate, like the government, grows weak as the number of its members increases, end quote. He says that larger numbers, he's talking about the numbers of tribunes, not the number of people in each tribune or something like that. He says that larger numbers of tribunes have a tendency to check each other. Well, wait, why wouldn't we want that? But, taken to this logical conclusion, we have one tribunate, and it is some kind of an anti-dictator that could veto any decision of the rest of the government. Again, the possibility, which is a real possibility of falsely identifying doing something versus undoing something, kind of makes this pointless, because it's really only a path to dictatorship albeit one that kind of favors the status quo. That doesn't really help. Rousseau recommends giving tribunates power only for certain intervals, not, quote, long enough to give abuses time to grow strong, end quote. He claims that no government anywhere in the history of humanity has ever tried this. And I'm not going to go through and research all the possibilities. Prove a negative, right? But the problem here is that if tribunates can veto things, can they not also veto their dissolution? How do you prevent that from happening? Might it not be possible that some group that raises up a tribunate to gain some kind of political victory would also argue to extend it indefinitely, so long as they continue to reap the benefit? These are entirely reasonable thoughts or objections to this notion that Rousseau is bringing up, but Rousseau doesn't even try to talk about any of the possibilities of them. Rousseau then says something a little odd. He says, tribunates are not part of the Constitution and can therefore be abolished without affecting the Constitution. Now, we have to go back, but Rousseau said all the way back in Book 2, Chapter 12, that the real constitution of the state is graven on the hearts of the citizens. It's not a real, written down. In Rousseau's framework, it doesn't necessarily need to just be limited to a written down thing. It doesn't even need to have a written down thing at all. And that's the problem here, right? If the Constitution is this fuzzy-wuzzy thing that nobody can put their finger down on, or even if it is, but it has some kind of, what would you call it, imprecise language, right? If it has any of those characteristics, then saying that it can be added or removed easily because they're not part of the Constitution is wishful thinking at best. If they want to pretend to be part of the Constitution, they'll do so. And it's worth noting that a smart tribunate, again, would simply attempt to veto attempts to abolish it. And it would have support from a decent number of the people, probably, because they're benefiting based on the tribunate's decisions. Rousseau finishes out the chapter. We're going to quote him one more time. He says, quote, "A newly restored magistrate starts not with the power his predecessor exercised, but with that which the law allows him," end quote. He's thinking about there's this judge who was in place for a long time, and he kind of was gathering more power, but if we throw him out and get someone else, then that person hasn't had the time to gather power. And there's a little bit of truth to that. But again, it's very hopeful on Rousseau's part. Usually it's not this clear-cut. In fact, a new magistrate might easily cite precedent as to the limits of his powers based on his predecessor, regardless of the actual wording of the law that instituted his position. You could try to help avoid this kind of carryover effect by giving the new magistrate's position a novel title, right? Like the previous guy was a district judge, and this guy is a county judge or something like that. And so, they're a little bit different, and so they can't make that precedent thing. But what they'll do, if they're smart, is they'll just kind of look for any meaningful overlap in their charters, and then look for any overlap with those, look at that overlap and compare it to precedents, and use those precedents at least to get the process started. They'll revive old precedent that way. And so this is the end of the chapter on tribunates. It just doesn't make a whole lot of sense. Rousseau is kind of all over the place. He's not justifying anything. He's creating a system. He's creating another thing to glom onto his system that just has really bad incentives. And he's not talking about any of the... He's not making a good argument that any of its good incentives are likely to happen at all. So, yeah, there's chapter 5, and let's keep going. All right, next up is Book 4, Chapter 6, and the title of this chapter is The Dictatorship. Rousseau begins this chapter by saying that, hey, bad laws can have dire consequences for the state, and it takes time to fix them. Therefore, it may at some point be necessary to suspend the operation of the law. Of course, Rousseau notes, this should only be done to deal with existential threats. But of course, anything is an existential threat when you have a thief calling himself a magistrate. There's no, there's no clear line here that someone's not going to try to cross. Furthermore, Rousseau has already created a system in which it should be relatively easy to eliminate bad laws. Simply assemble the sovereign, and the general will is made clear, as Rousseau's already said, and according to his estimation. It seems like the suspension of the legal system is something that actually goes much further than necessary to achieve the desired ends, assuming that these desired ends are good, and even by Rousseau's earlier arguments. It seems to do way worse things than you need to be done, basically. So Rousseau continues by saying that while the laws are suspended, the quote, public security should be entrusted to the most worthy. Now, anyone reading Rousseau today and feeling drawn toward this kind of nonsense really needs to go take a look at Hayek's Why the Worst Get on Top and go read it a few times until that feeling is completely eradicated. Why would a country suffering from an abundance of bad law be able to choose a good dictator? Already they have shown themselves to be irredeemably corrupt. And what good does one more majority vote do except to say, okay, we're throwing away all the laws? Well, it doesn't make any sense that there's going to be actually much going on here. Rousseau says that this dictator can either change the form of administration of the laws, or he may silence the laws and, quote, suspend for a moment the sovereign authority, end quote. This sounds pretty bad. In short, but the in short summary here is that he may interpret the laws in novel ways. And of course, the dangerous incentives of this idea are not even seen by Rousseau. It's a complete blind spot. Next, Rousseau says that the general will must always intend for the state to not perish. Now, again, what's happening here is that Rousseau is taking the first law of nature, or the law of self-preservation, as it might be called, and applying it to a being that does not actually exist, in order to justify any sort of kind of abominable tyranny needed to keep it alive. And he's saying this after he's already said that some states deserve to perish with all haste, since they are irretrievably broken. Where do we draw the line? Rousseau doesn't give us an answer. He just points at some and says, this is bad, this should collapse. But, anything other than this, you just got to do everything possible to keep this social compact alive, even though it's not serving anyone's purposes. But then we get the fun point, where Rousseau notes that this method of the dictator was commonly used in ancient Rome. And now it all kind of snaps into place. Rousseau has this inexplicable adoration for a warlord conquest state that breaks most of his rules, and yet he loves this state so much that he's constantly using it as an example of, oh, you should do this because Rome did this. Well, this doesn't match up with any of the stated goals of your proposed framework. Well, yeah, but Rome was really successful. Successful how? Well, successful in the sense that it lasted a long time, tyrannized a bunch of people, and conquered a bunch of land. Well, none of these things are part of what a government is supposed to do, according even to the beginning chapters where Rousseau was talking about it. So, it's not a very good argument. Rousseau goes on. He says, the highly moral people of Rome, ? Didn't fear abuse of power, but rather the extra power, quote, appeared to be burdensome to him, the dictator, who was clothed with it, end quote. I mean, maybe sometimes, right? In the best possible situations, a guy gets power and he's an honorable person, and he says, I only want this power for a little while to do this one thing and then I'm out, right? And, I've got to be very careful not to harm the people. There are certainly good, honorable people that exist that you could put them in that situation and they wouldn't be immediately corrupted. Maybe they would be after a couple of years. That's another question. But it's also possible for these dictators to simply be good actors and moan and groan about, oh, it's so bad that I have all this power, and pretend that it's very, very painful to be thrown into this briar patch. It might not be real, and so we need to be very careful that we don't put people in power who have that, what would you call it? That ability to act as if they're so beleaguered by all the power that you've given them. Rousseau continues by noting, or at least stating, that the decline of the Roman Republic was not characterized by too much use of the dictator, but actually by too little in Rousseau's estimation. He gives an example of the Catilinarian conspiracy, but he kind of ignores the fact that the simple calling of a dictator does not guarantee that that dictator's agenda is the same as Rousseau's, the people's, the general will's, any of that stuff. There's no guarantees here. You're just rolling the dice and hoping that you get very lucky. Rousseau says that the length of dictatorship should be strictly limited by law. Rome, he says, used a 6-month period. Longer terms permit the dictator to become, quote, either tyrannical or idle, end quote. But, again, the purpose of the dictator is that he can freely reinterpret the laws. One of the big problems with giving unlimited power to one man is that you'd better be damn sure he's the right one, not just for you, but for everyone. And it may be that such a man just simply does not exist. When a state grows beyond the bounds of its usefulness, this is going to be the case. There's going to be minorities that are being trampled over. There's going to be even, plurality groups like, big popular groups that are at odds on some particular policy of the state. There's no way to get around this. This is just what happens when people grow in number and differentiate themselves. And, you know, the solution is to get rid of the dominion and to split up the state, not to have some dictator pick winners and losers. That's just going to make more people angry. And that's not what we want government to do, incite violence. So, incite, a violence against random people. Anyway, that is the end of Chapter 6, and so let us move on. All right, Book 4, Chapter 7, the Censorship. I mean, these 3 chapters suck. We have the Tribunate, the Dictatorship, and the Censorship. I mean, is there a point at which we can say 3 strikes, you're out? You don't get to make any more government ideas anymore, Rousseau? Apparently not. It's his book. Well, he begins this chapter by saying, quote, "The censorship is the declaration of the public judgment. Ellipsis, the censorial tribunal, so far from being the arbiter of the people's opinion, only declares it. And as soon as the 2-part company, its decisions are null and void," end quote. This seems to me like wishful thinking at best. As if there's some body that could be convened to say, this is a good opinion, or this is a bad opinion, and not expect that judgment to be used to further someone's political career or agenda, or damage someone else's. I mean, it's and then the whole thing about the decisions being null and void after they part company doesn't really make sense. Obviously, those decisions are going to be used, going forward to say, oh, this is a good opinion. This is a good opinion. There's nothing in the framework here that prevents that from happening. So I don't know. Rousseau says, quote, "Men always love what is good or what they find good. It is in judging what is good that they go wrong," end quote. That's why they need enlightened rulers to tell them what is right. And conversely, they must trust their rulers because they're clearly enlightened, because they're rulers. This isn't circular at all. Don't worry about it. Rousseau says that the censorship cannot help when morality has already degenerated, but only to preserve morality before it degenerates. So basically the answer is censor hard, censor early, censor often. This is, of course, an attempt to kind of re-educate minorities upon whom the state is acting as a parasite, and to convince them that their subjugation and exploitation is kind of correct or in their benefit in some spiritual way. Nothing could possibly go wrong with this kind of power. Quote, "The censorship upholds morality by preventing opinion from growing corrupt, by preserving its rectitude by means of wise applications, and sometimes even by fixing it when it is still uncertain," end quote. And corrupt, but according to whom? To the people that are already ruling the state? To a majority that's exploiting a minority? Who gets to decide where this corruption is? Is there any kind of objective stance? Or is it just going to be a bunch of people saying, I think this is bad? Well, there's not really anything in the framework that prevents you from doing that, basically. So inevitably, that's the result you're going to get. And then, I mean, there's not much in this chapter, but Rousseau finishes it off, because this is weird, because Rousseau doesn't actually talk much about, what the censorship does. He says it declares good or bad opinions, and he calls it the censorship, which implies to me that certain documents or opinions are going to be, officially, prevented from being spread around, something like that. But he doesn't really give any, idea of, what the thing is going to do kind of in the medium term. It's just like, oh yeah, they say this opinion is good, this opinion is bad, and then they're done. It's like, well, no, but there's more to it than that. You can't just do that and hope that solves the problem. That doesn't do anything. And even then, the incentive structure that you've created is horrifying. Now, Rousseau does seem to kind of finish this chapter with an example, but it's not very illustrative. I'll quote it for you, and then we'll talk about it for a minute. But this doesn't really help a lot. Here we go. Quote, "A man of bad morals, having made a good proposal in the Spartan council, the ephors neglected it and caused the same proposal to be made by a virtuous citizen. What an honor for the one and what a disgrace for the other, without praise or blame of either. Certain drunkards from Samos polluted the tribunal of the ephors. The next day a public edict gave Samians permission to be filthy. An actual punishment would not have been so severe as such an impunity." I mean, fair enough. This is actually some kind of an example, and it seems akin to public shaming by a passive-aggressive decree, right? But yeah, you guys made this area dirty, so we're going to give you legal permission to be filthy, and then that's supposed to kind of clean them up or encourage them to clean themselves up. I mean, is this supposed to be some kind of a panacea for government problems? And if so, for what exactly? Rousseau doesn't really explain, he just kind of notes it as like a fun fact. When would this kind of shaming actually work? When would it not work? In what situations is it appropriate to try it? How do we avoid provoking some kind of a violent response by this kind of, this kind of activity? Rousseau, as usual, gives us no answers. So, that completes these 3 chapters. Systems to be added onto governments to make them probably even worse. But Rousseau hopes that they'll make them better. I don't know what to say. We already were in pretty deep, you-know-what with earlier stuff. Things already are not looking good for Rousseau's framework, and now he's just glomming on these little hints of stuff from ancient Rome or ancient Sparta and saying, oh, this will make it better, but without really explaining how or why or any of the details on how to use it. So, I don't know. These 3 chapters seem like an invitation to more tyranny. But, I don't know. You might have your own opinion. Anyway, that will do it for today. Hope you enjoyed this. Hope this was informative. We're going to be finishing up the actual contents of the book next time. And maybe we'll also be doing kind of a review, an overview at the end of this one. Or maybe we'll do that a week afterwards. I kind of want to be done with this book. So, we'll see. But anyway, that's all I've got for you for today. Thanks for watching. Thanks for listening. Hope you found this informative. If you like what I'm doing, if you want to support the channel, you know what to do. And I will see you next time. Have a good rest of your week.